Alex, warmest welcome to the Genius Leadership Podcast. I'm very happy to have you as a guest.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Anna. I'm delighted to be here with you.
So, Alex, I usually start with asking my guests, what is leadership and who is a leader for you?
Oh, gosh. What is leadership? There are so many facets to leadership. But if I'm forced to have one, I mean, because there are many: consistency, courage, humility, these kinds of very important values. But if you're going to give me one, which I'm forced to adopt in a sense, or at least nominate as the ideal of leadership, it is a leader is someone who creates a narrative of the future, a vision around which supporters and colleagues can coalesce around and support and help drive forward to reaching that goal or that vision. I mean, I'm a semiotician by profession, but I'm a former academic. I taught literature. So I believe strongly that human beings are homo narrans. We are storytelling creatures. And actually, if you look at history, some of the greatest leaders we think of, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Moses, for instance, Abraham Lincoln, these were actually people whose leadership was forged in storytelling. Certainly Martin Luther King's was, in particular, the relationship between the African American community and its role in its the allegory or the metaphor of the slaves in Egypt, of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. And I think that leadership is absolutely about developing a narrative for people to really feel excited about, and to galvanize a sense of energy among supporters, followers, and those around you, colleagues, to drive forward an agenda for the realization of a vision.
That's brilliant. We talk a lot about the visionary leadership on this podcast and with a lot of my guests, and they see the value of it. And the definition of leadership comes a lot through the visionary leadership, that you are the person who is seeing this future and is painting that to the rest of the team to get them on board and have them on board. And I really like how you twisted a bit to actually have it as a narrative. So it's not only about having the vision, but it's also being able to communicate it in an entertaining, inspiring, and enlightening way. So let's talk about that.
I think that one of the things that's I want to be very cautious about this, because I think that the type of leaders and leadership we've spoken about, even just now, is a very 20th century or very historical model, by which I mean it's a top-down structure. The idea of a single individual at the apex of a community or a group or a tribe of belonging, who is the one who has the vision and who's the one the others follow. I think that particular structure is primarily often associated with a society based on hierarchy. It constructs its own hierarchy. Therefore, a society based on leadership narratives, that kind, or on the vision of a leader, are hierarchical. They're pyramidal. They're by structure, and I think that's quite old-fashioned in a way. So I don't think I'm talking about a leadership where you have and I may have mentioned, but I'd rather prefer to talk about leadership as a narrative, rather than the storyteller. In a sense, all of the great leaders, as I mentioned, have been at the apex. But I think we're in a society now where the narrative is about something which comes from the bottom up, which is a shared narrative. Yes, it might have been delivered by a single individual, but it's a narrative which is brought into and shared by others who feel empowered to become leaders themselves, and to drive and be part of the team driving the vision forward, rather than deferring all of the decision making to a single figurehead figure. And I think that's something we're in probably a transition period in terms of that kind of leadership at the moment. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that kind of transition. Barack Obama was swept into office on the kind of bottom-up vision that I'm talking about, which was encapsulated in 3 words: "Yes, we can," which was a brilliant idea of communal, associative, communitarian, bottom-up, empowered value system in which everyone was seen to be a leader, and in which he was positioning himself brilliantly, not as the leader at the apex of the vision and of the person to be deferred to, but as the person who was merely reminding everyone of the agenda, which was one of progress, a progressive social agenda in a broad sense. And he was reminding everyone that it was achievable through common consent, which was, of course, the tradition in American political history. We the people, yes, we can. So he was drawing upon that leadership principle, which was founded in America. Where the problem started for him, and he was a great leader, but the problem started for him is that he was asking everyone to say, yes, we can, and to elect him to an office, which by virtue of its structure was at the apex of an old-fashioned system. So he was swept into office in a bottom-up structure, but once he was in office, he was in a top-down leadership model. So there was a clash between the two models, which I think affected his leadership all the way through. He's still a much beloved leader by those on the progressive left in the United States and around the world, as a sign of in a kind of intelligent moderation. He was kind of leader as philosopher statesman rather than a philosopher poet statesman rather than soldier statesman, as previous leaders had been. But I think that reflected a very interesting shift, and I think the political structures we have around us, which are so oriented towards leadership, are really it's problematic because they are structured. Society is structured on those top-down structures which has come from the ancient world and which Western civilization structured itself around for so long. And yet leadership is beginning to move away, because we know that so much of leadership in conversation around of that has been filled with narrow values of what building a good society is about. But that definition comes from a very narrow definition of what a good society is. It's primarily white, it's primarily masculine, it's primarily heterosexual. So that those kinds of leadership visions and agendas have primarily come from that position. A lot of the social progressive leadership roles have pushed back against that and have been bottom-up structures. Martin Luther King's leadership was a bottom-up structure, even though he was the leader. Cesar Chavez, who Biden has just got a statue, a bust behind his shoulder in the office. Cesar Chavez brought together Hispanic farm workers in America. So there was bottom-up leadership has come from bottom-up. It's when you get into positions of authority that the problems sometimes start. That so I think leadership is in a kind of is in negotiation at the moment between these traditional structuralist models of leadership and what we might call post-structuralist models of leadership, which attempt to be bottom-up, which attempt to be more communitarian, which attempt to be more empowering for individuals, and in which followership is as important as leadership. And that's a very different agenda for what leadership can be. And that emphasizes ideas of humility and empowerment. And as I said, it's about a communal narrative around which everyone can coalesce, and everyone feels empowered to drive forward that agenda and deliver it together rather than individually.
I hear the word followership more and more, Alex, and I would like to, I could imagine that that's actually a new word for many of our listeners. Shall we give a definition to it? What do you see as the followership, or what is that term about?
Yeah, followership is, I think it's the idea, actually, followership, that you are part of a community, that your goal is not to try and dominate, to try and impose your will, or to try and impose an agenda upon a group, but on the contrary, that you were brought into the idea of that you are a single individual who is part of an empowered group who can work together in that communitarian or associative sense I suggested, in order to help deliver a vision together. And it's one in which leadership values and in which decision making is created. Perhaps it must be invested in a single individual, but eventually, and she must make the right decisions. But but influenced by those around her, hopefully. But I think it's about followership is about a belief that helping and being part of the group rather than being at the top of the group is as important to the delivery of the vision as leadership, and that there is a kind of fulfillment from being part of that group to deliver and working hard as part of it, and as an important empowered part of it, rather than capitulating to the idea, the Western value in which you are only worthwhile, you are only fulfilled as an individual when you have fulfilled some kind of top-down leadership structure. And I think that's the essence of followership, that it doesn't need to be fulfilled as a person and to fulfill the vision. You don't need to feel or be made to feel that you are less worthy if you have not fulfilled this, a position as a as this single individual making the decisions. That, to my mind, is followership, and it comes from an attempt to understand that society, it's not good for society, but based on the competition of leadership, of top-down leadership, because it creates narrow interest rather than communal interest. It creates a self-absorption rather than mutual assistance, and it creates a kind of egotistical self-fulfillment rather than a kind of egotistical plural fulfillment. That your ego can be satisfied not by the glory of others following you, but of you being part of a team. And I think that's a really different way of thinking about it, but it demands a social shift, because our society has been so invested in that idea of the single individual as the apex, who we lead, who is also utterly fallible, is the person with whom we invest all our hopes, but also the person who also holds our fears as well. And if they show themselves to be flawed, then they also represent our greatest fears about humanity as well.
I love it. I love this idea of really creating a followership. And as a leader, if you succeed to create this real followership where everyone is feeling valued and feels fulfilled, as you said, no matter what part of the community they are, they just feel like they're part of the community.
Yeah.
It's a very win-win-win situation for everyone. So
yes.
How, if we think about the business world, how can leaders create this movement of followership through the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to be clear that followership is not about being a sheep and sort of blindly following the direction where you're asked to go in. Or I think that, to my mind, the leadership in the followership construct comes from a narrative, not a person. That's the critical thing. If there is a narrative, the narrative might have emerged from a group of individuals, but or it might have been emerged from an individual. But actually, followership is about a kind of communal leadership. To be a follower doesn't mean you are divested of responsibility for making decisions or for generating ideas. You are about the progress of your business or your society. It demands the idea that you are invested in still coming up with those ideas and in still working towards a goal. But it means that, and you still have responsibility for it, but it means that you are not attempting to dominate a group or through competition gain control over that group in order to impose a singular vision through which you expect everyone to adhere. And of course, Western style of leadership has often been that kind of, and I'm not just talking about totalitarian states, which are notorious for that. Often those leaders who we think of as being, at least history has characterized as good leaders, Churchill, FDR, dare I say it, Margaret Thatcher, and there are arguments as to whether she was or wasn't a good leader, but certainly people who had Tony Blair, these are people who held office for a long time. They tried to impose a vision. They were, conviction politicians. I think followership is actually about the construction of a narrative which everyone is bought into. and feels empowered to participate in. And then they themselves, followership demands a kind of them living, breathing the narrative, working towards that narrative, and then themselves, in a sense, perhaps taking leadership of smaller areas and imparting that kind of the excitement and enthusiasm and energy of the narrative to their colleagues, and galvanizing their colleagues' excitement and empowering their colleagues. And I think that's a very powerful message, where you have essentially what you're talking about there is a leadership structure or a followership structure, which is about enfranchising everyone in a society or in a business to feel that they have ownership of the direction of travel, and that ownership is a communal one, that they can see everyone galvanized around them towards that vision and towards the delivery of that vision through their own particular work, rather than following a diktat which has been handed down from a kind of leadership structure whom you follow with a kind of idolizing effect. And I think that's crucial. There's a subtle difference, but I do think that it's a misinterpretation to see followership as a kind of sheepish sort of a weak-minded following.
And that's not how I got it. And it's interesting that you want to give this clarification. It's very good for the clarity. What I see. What I thought when you were talking about the followership in the first place, I was thinking a lot about my generation who are in the workplace to contribute to a purpose, right? And there is a lot of disengagement, and there are a lot of frustrations among people of my age who don't feel like they're contributing to this vision of the future that they feel that they want. And that's the thing, like we're talking about skilled, ambitious people who have their mind, who have their heart, and they want to contribute to a better world. Yeah. Yet the leadership there is failing to create this followership where people actually feel like they are this piece of a puzzle where we together can actually create synergies and create the beauty and the change that we want to see.
I mean, look, it troubles me that there are a lot of leadership courses in the world, and there's a lot of, different communities emphasize the need for leadership. And I think it's important to have people of experience in positions, but it's also for people in those positions to understand that they don't know everything, and that their experience, particularly since the world is changing fast, that younger people have an experience and an understanding of the world and of the future of that world, which is greater than your own. I mean, I know that from my own little environment that I work in, where I was the founder of a business which I had no intention of building up into having employees. That was never in my mind. I was just, when I set up my own business, my goal was to pay my bills, and the idea of growing a business was not something I set out. Some people sit down at the beginning and say on the back of an envelope, this is my plan for the growth of a business. Mine has grown organically, but I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. I've been educated by those mistakes, and I've learnt by failure as much as by success about what good leadership is. And I think that, to my mind, good leadership is a kind of understanding of empowering others, of building a narrative, of creating an environment of mutual care and concern and human warmth, and that's a very important part of it. That a kind of rapacious business, commercial, goal-oriented value system on its own does not create a kind of followership structure. And I hope, I've got certainly more experience than some of my colleagues who are considerably younger than me, but I have only more experience in certain areas. They have more experience in others, and so I've learned from them on a daily basis. And that's what I mean by followership. That to my mind, that's about creating a group of people who are supporting each other and learning from each other. That's real leadership, to my mind, is the ability to learn from everyone, and to make use of that learning and acknowledge that learning and make use of it in terms of empowering people and bringing people with you, and then you thrusting other people forward to enable them to lead, make decisions as you're going along, rather than just constantly being the person who feels that they have the authority to dominate their and impose their will. Those kinds of value systems are beginning to be outdated, and we've seen examples of that in the public press where people have presented themselves in that way. People who are, chief executives of large corporations who are found out because they represent themselves in that way, and in a kind of rapacious commercial way and a rapacious human way, where they position work ethic above a kind of care ethic, and that won't wash anymore. Those kinds of value systems won't wash anymore. That's a very powerful shift in our society, which is for the better, and it's necessary because we're aware that mental health issues are so profoundly fragile and profoundly important in our society. I think that's a kind of, that's why leadership needs to change, and why followership is probably a healthier way to develop social structures. And I'm quite aware when I'm saying that you need people with experience to set an agenda, but it's how that agenda is then delivered is the question, I think, that we're talking about in terms of the shift of kinds of leadership structures we're referring to.
You've got a lot of points that I would like to touch upon, and I'm already getting lost. Like, which direction should we take?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm digressive by nature.
It's just beautiful to see your passion about this, and how many ideas you have, and how you're communicating them. It's wonderful. What I was interested about what you're saying, it sounds like leadership is a lot about listening and feeling the spirit and the temperature, and being able to bring all those ideas and thoughts and feelings together and actually make something good out of it. So it's a bit of like a baker, maybe you can think, and like everyone is like, to make a good cake, you need all those ingredients. Sure. So everyone is important on the team, in a community. And yes, it's the baker's responsibility to understand, like, okay, now it's time for this ingredient to go in. Yeah, those kind of things.
You've hit upon something very profound, which is in the public discourse at the moment, which is, how does one disagree with each other? How does one make space for another person's opinion and not feel threatened by it oneself? To feel that another person's opinion, which might be different than yours, does not undermine yours or devalue your opinion, but that it builds on and strengthens and can be an alternative. One of the things I think that I found most profound, the biggest realization, I think, and this was even before I became, before I was building a business, I realized in many things in life, there are not rights and wrongs. Not all. I mean, there are plenty of rights and wrongs, and so I don't want to be clear that I'm not saying in life, Jen, but in certain, pardon me, in certain aspects, there are not right and wrong decisions. There are choices. And that's what makes leadership sometimes very difficult, or followership indeed very difficult, because it's scary to make choices when you've got no guarantee that choice is going to take you in a good pathway, and that not taking that choice might equally take you in a good pathway. It's just a choice. And there are so many parts of that in life, and so leadership is no different than that. The choice of the choice of a newspaper in the morning, or where you turn the telly on, which channel you're going to watch, is that's banal, but it can make a choice as to what information you receive. So but I think that crucially what we're talking about there is about having the courage to enable difference and to have your opinions challenged as a leader. So you were referring to listening, yes, to listen to others, but also to encourage others to tell you what they really feel. We know, for instance, there have been plenty of examples documented of top-down structures where the authority of a leader figure has intimidated juniors And in a situation, whether that's a medical one or a governmental one or a military one, those juniors can see something wrong happening, decisions being made which are going to be disastrous, yet because of the leadership structures, they have felt disempowered and disenfranchised from being able to make a contribution, and have allowed things to go wrong in surgery or military situations, rather than challenge the authority of the person who's the de facto leader. And we, that's a disaster. We know that's a disaster. It's a disaster for businesses as well. So empowering people to be able to feel their voice is valued, and to be able to understand as an individual that people who disagree that's really progressive. That's how progress starts. That's how you develop society, by having discussion and debate. That's what open society is about. It's about having free debate without offense, and knowing that there's an excitement in learning for another person's opinion, and to have yours challenged through good argument. That's a really profound way to develop a way of making choices, rather than to have a conviction which is untested and then to just force it through regardless. That is not progress. It's not the way we've progressed as human beings. It's also about having the humility to understand you don't know everything, and that it's exciting to recognize other people's talents, and to be aware of them, and to be excited by that, and to know that there's actually wisdom to be gained in a coalescence, and the building of that, all the different ingredients to create the cake or the loaf that you're making, because that will improve the loaf and the quality of the cake.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, like, I'm actually seeing a lot of this shift going on, but maybe I'm living in my own bubble where I am connecting to leaders who are thinking this way, who are creating the synergies, who are working hard on creating this psychological safety where everyone can be questioned without feeling threatened, who everyone can, or like how they can question without being threatened, and where they really value each other's opinions and don't take it personally. So I see a lot of this shift going on in the business world, at least, and I'm happy to see that.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I hope so. Look, we've still, I think, as I said, we're in transition. We're in a transition state where where we still, the major corporations are still run on top-down hierarchical structures, but I think even within that, there are those who are now taking leadership positions who are particularly women. It seems to me. Not always, but many women who are much more engaged in an enfranchising, empowering role.
Do you think women better at this, let's say, at this transition, or what helps them get further in that process?
Yeah, I'm cautious about saying they're better. What I'm saying is that they're able to do it more instinctively than men. Why? Maybe because they've been on receiving end for generations of being part of a system which has not heard their voice. Therefore, when they get into positions of authority, they're much more conscious of creating a sense of this empowered followership structure and of its value. Maybe those whose voices are disenfranchised and disempowered in society are those whose voices we need to hear most, because of that. Secondly, because that top-down structure comes from a masculine archetype, which is very ancient, which comes from, the anthropologists will be able to explain this more than I will, but it comes from that idea of the hunter-gatherer ideal, where glory and fulfillment is seen as capturing and conquest. The human narrative of society and military power and the formation of nations and the formations of government is through competition. So I think that idea of overcoming that instinct to leadership and competition is something which is fundamental to the success of leadership. There's something probably negative in this idea that leadership is gained through competition, because that's also about voices, trying to promote your voice over others, which is not helpful. So I'm not. my instinct is not to say that women are somehow genetically better at it, because I refuse. I'm loath to deal in those terms with those kinds of, I think they're troubling biological. There's enough in human history to say that any arguments about biological or gender or genetic or racial contexts of superiority in one thing or another is a dangerous territory to go down. I don't believe that. I believe it's through experience, and that men have been conditioned into a structure of competition, and of the idea of success through conquest, which I think is very now seen, understandably and very correctly, as a toxic narrative, a toxic structure. And
to be fair, I'm thinking that there was the need of that. That's why it was there. So we as a humanity wouldn't get where we are without those structures, very top-down structures, without being a scientist and without being able to run the time back and see how it would be in the other way. I believe that it all makes sense. But there's also, it's fascinating to see this transition now of women, because I feel like women are still, or at the moment, there is a lot of competition going on there, because we are not used to being that many in the workplace.
Sure.
We are not used to being in the power positions. So there is a competition going on. There is quite a lot of discussion of that.
I mean, it's also very difficult for what are the expectations for women when they get into leadership positions. The expectation is for them to behave like men. That leadership, if they don't behave that way, they haven't been true leaders, because we're so conditioned to understand leadership in such narrow traditional terms. So I think we're training ourselves, and it'll take potentially several generations to train ourselves to understand a followership structure, a bottom-up, a communitarian vision. And I'm not being, I'm trying to avoid being a kind of talk about this as constructing businesses as a kind of hippie commune. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a narrative, which is what leadership is. It's the narrative which creates and drives the goal forward, and groups. It's a group which is enabling a sense of leadership, rather than, and everyone feels an ability to participate. I think that's absolutely fundamental. One of the best lessons that was ever taught to me was in a boardroom of a business in America. We did some work for a business called Panera Bread, which is in America. Those of you who are watching from America will know it. It's a bakery, sandwich, takeaway and eat in store, which sells soup and sandwiches, and bread. And there's about 2,000 stores across the United States. It's a high street brand. It's similar to Pret in Europe and in America as well. It's although it's not pre-made, it's made to order, the food there, and it's fresh. And we did some work for the brand around communicating wellness. This is many years ago. 6 years ago, probably 6 years ago, and we were in the boardroom, and we had to in giving our report, we had to tell the board some pretty uncomfortable things that they needed to hear, and I was slightly nervous about it, and in particular I was nervous because, and the whole thing was hilarious, because it was a very old-fashioned leadership structure. The man who'd set the business up 30 years beforehand was still in charge, and he had been in advertising. He had in the TV adverts. It was him standing outside, opening the door for customers to go in. It was very much about him. He was arriving late to the meeting, and everyone else, all of the other senior people around the room said, "Let's not start until he arrives." He came in, we started, and even halfway through, he said, "I've just got to go out to the bathroom." He said, "Do carry on." He left the room. All of the other guys said, "Let's just wait until he gets back." It was a very top-down structure, right? It was very top-down, and he was the hunter-gatherer in the room. He was the alpha in the room. It was very clear. And at the end of it, when we told them some pretty hard-hitting realities about where their business was and where culture was, and how there was a gap between them, and in order to align themselves with where culture was moving to, and in particular where the consumers were moving, they needed to make some fairly significant changes, which would have demanded some serious investment from them. At the end of the presentation, he turned to me and he said, he turned to me and to my colleagues, and he said, pardon me. He said, "Well, you've just ruined 30 years of my life." And my heart sank. And he said, "But what you've said is absolutely right. He said, and you serve your clients best when you tell them the truth. And I think there's something powerful about that idea, that in leadership, if you've got to be prepared to hear the truth, even if it's even if the truth is uncomfortable, or the truth as other people see it.
Yeah.
That's uncomfortable, but I think it's absolutely crucial. And overcoming the inclination to see leadership in this old-fashioned, highly structured, top-down structure is absolutely something that is going to be fundamental for the success of future businesses and future corporations, because the startups that are being founded now are, yes, there's a lot that's been put into vision and the vision of the founder in terms of a progress, but that founder has to, in a sense, also empower followers. That's the founder's purpose, a purpose, vision, narrative is absolutely a purpose-based vision or narrative is absolutely crucial. But that person needs to also have the ability to bring people with them and create.
Take Science Salad and you're growing the company organically as an example. How did you build this narrative, and how did you get people on board?
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing between talking and there's another between acting, isn't there? So look, there are those who are. I'm not I wasn't a businessman, and I learned to be a businessman, as I said, by making some good judgments and making some bad judgments. And I was also, I'm 51. I've also been raised in an environment where leadership structures were categorized and performed for me publicly as a kind of this top-down structure. And I've learned over time that is not a positive way to run a business, and to work in partnership with people and to encourage and I think is crucial. I've always tried to have a care ethic there from the very, very beginning. I think that's absolutely fundamental. But I think that on a personal note, the success, as I said, the success I've had, and I've got a wonderful team now, partly the success of the strength of the team and the company culture we now have, and I take nothing for granted, but it with modesty, is because I've had the ability to have some humility and to listen and learn from others around me and to take advice and to feel a sense of shared decision making and to have a good sense of humor and to feel that that others that others know and have a good instinct as well. I think there's also a sense in which people have to recognize that experience is valuable as well. I'm talking about if you don't have experience, if you've been working in a business for a year or 2 years, that those with 10, 20 years experience, have something that's worth listening to as well. And I think listening takes place at all levels, and being able to learn together. I think that's crucial. That's something that I've learned is it's learning together that's vital and valuable. And that's something that I found very powerful in helping to develop a business, and learning to listen, but always having that sense of a care ethic at the core of a business, which the recent experiences at KPMG, where the CEO was forced to resign, or felt he needed to resign, was encouraged to, because he had made some comments which were not caring, which were a not understanding of people's personal experiences, and was not able to leap from his own experience and put himself into the mindset and lifestyle of another person to understand what they're going through. That's a kind of social empathy, which is fundamental to leadership, and that's absolutely crucial. And that's a base. That's a base for me. That's just about being a decent human being, which is absolutely fundamental. And putting that above the profit motive. Actually, the profit motive will come. The profit motive will come. I read a fantastic obituary for a man called Zeph Eisenberg, who sadly passed away within the last 12 months, not through COVID, I don't think. He'd been a biker and had been something he hadn't committed himself to too much until he got into his 20s, and he got very interested in weightlifting, and he discovered that whey powder helped with the development of muscles, and developed a business called Maxi Muscle, which is a business which sells whey powder in these enormous tubs to weightlifters for muscle development. And he made millions of pounds out of it, built the business, sold the business, made millions of pounds. And there's a wonderful line at the end of this obituary where he'd been tremendously successful. And at the end, he said, there are two key things, he said, in life. He said, work hard and behave ethically, and the money will follow. And I just thought that's a wonderful message, actually, that actually working hard is absolutely fundamental, and having a work ethic, but also learning hard is something that I've taken to heart as well, because I've learned sometimes the hard way, and that's actually been a good thing over the longer term. And I've learned from my wonderful colleagues who are just absolutely brilliant people, brilliantly talented, and good fun, and that's something I enjoy. It gets me up in the morning, apart from my family and the other joys of life. Working with people you learn from is something that's a real pleasure. That's something that is not often said about leadership structures.
Yeah, that's a beautiful idea of actually like having the pleasure of working with people from whom you can learn as a leader. Alex, we discussed in the pre-chat about the risk attitude towards risk as an entrepreneur and as a business. Shall we tap into that a bit before we wrap up? Because I think it's a very important idea as well about the owning business, building a business, and just taking any decisions.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I think that I've seen in corporations. Look, it's really difficult. I mean, I'm agency side, not client side, and my business is small. But every decision you make about business, together or individually, but preferably together, is filled with risk. And the success and big success is only achieved by taking risk. Ultimately, if you're risk averse, and I'm generally more, ironically, I'm progressive by philosophy, by politically progressive, by inclination, but I'm also in terms of social, socially progressive, but I'm also conservative with a small c, in terms of taking risks sometimes. And I recognize that's a limitation for me, which is why I need, as the de facto founder of a business, why I need the support of others around me and to learn from them in order to feel comfortable to take those risks sometimes, and to help me overcome my own natural limitation. So I worry with some corporations. Risk is huge for big corporations because it involves investment. It involves often the stock price. Your personal job is on the line, therefore your personal livelihood is on the line. So it's very easy for me to sit here and talk about the need for risk. But I think that I worry that there is a climate in which there has become a kind of risk aversion, and in which there is an attempt to narrow the pathway down so much in terms of the debates within corporations that risk is limited, to the point where we don't go forward with things. And I think that's stifling, and that's followership must be about seeing the value of taking risks sometimes, and of taking that risk together, rather than that risk being invested in a single individual who lives and dies by that decision alone. Right? That's often what leadership has been about. Conviction leadership. You get to the top. I'm the person who's going to lead us forward. but that's also the person whom everyone else, it's easy for them to invest them with the risk and say, well, you took the risk, it's your fault. We've divested ourselves of the risk. It hasn't worked out. You're to blame for that. And we're happy to blame you for that because we didn't take the risk. And I think good followership must be about learning together, must be about fostering empowerment, and must be about fostering voices which are valued, and a sense in which a narrative, you've coalesced around a narrative, but it also must be one in which you take the risk together. And I think that's part of followership as well. Followership shouldn't be at the expense of risk taking. It shouldn't be about, spreading the risk to the extent where in order to get everyone to agree, you just do what the lowest common denominator in order to satisfy everyone. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you actually have to go for it. And I think leadership is sometimes about making the risk. There's a wonderful phrase. I don't know who said it, but someone once said, if you in leadership, and not as a leader, and I think this is true. I want to talk about leadership rather than as a leader, because I much prefer this idea of communal shared leadership. But in leadership, if you haven't offended anyone in the course of your leadership process, it's as if you haven't done anything at all. Because at some point, the risk to move forward to do something will mean that someone might be pissed off. And to limit the risk of pissing everyone off so much that you don't do anything means that you can't move forward. And I think that's where courage comes in. That's the other bit, which is where courage must be part of it. Giving yourself knowledge, learning from others, absolutely part of it. But having the courage to do things together and take risks together is absolutely fundamental to good followership structures.
It sounds to me like it's a lot about the ownership. So really creating the ownership within the whole community, within the whole team, that everyone owns part of it. And it's both in the good times and the bad times, right? Everyone owns the success when it happens, and everyone owns the responsibility for the failures and the learnings.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, look, if you look at startup businesses, a lot of them are being set up. A lot of the more progressive ones are being set up literally as shared ownership businesses. But ownership is about the ownership of the fulfillment of the narrative. But that's why I think narratives are so important, because people feel a sense of ownership if they're bought into a narrative. If the narrative speaks to them, if the story at the core of the business or the core of the brand or of the core of society or of the nation is one which is empowering, exciting, promises a future which is worthwhile, and an ideal which lifts the human heart, then that's a powerful vision. And I know that may sound ridiculous if you've got a business which is selling widgets. You think to lift a narrative which lifts the human heart, but actually that's about building something together and being able to share in the success of that. And I don't just mean financial sharing. I mean there is a kind of fulfillment for a group of individuals in building something together and seeing the success of something being built. Before I set up my own business 14 years ago, I was working at a company which had been set up by two women, and there were 5 partners, and I was at number 17 or 18 through the door, and the business grew when I left 5 years later to about 150 people in several different offices. And I can tell you that there was a sense of communal ownership, even though there were only 5 names on the actual, who owned the business technically. There was a sense of a culture of mutual ownership in terms of the development and the growth of the business and the success and excitement of that. That did come from a leadership structure which had acknowledged created a kind of followership model, which was very, very good. Interestingly, I left the point they were sold. The new ownership reverted to and created a structure which was much more top down and alienated a lot of the people who had worked there for many years to see the growth, and created a different kind of value system within the business, which eroded eroded some of that, quite a lot of that, the kind of ethic that had been there previously, because it reverted to a very, very top down, much less, the ethic care seemed to have lost out to the profit motive. That balance seemed to shift.
It's tragic to observe sometimes when you see this beautiful community really working together, and then in comes someone with a different interest, and they.
Yeah, I mean, it was still a successful business, but it depends what your definition of success is. Yeah. And I think that was an interesting challenge for that business. And I say this because not with any criticism, because it's not for me. I'm still in touch with many of those people, and we forged groups of friendship groups which are deeply meaningful to me, and they were deep. They've transcended the fact that we work together. They've transcended that. We're now mates. And good friends, because we were bonded, we were forged. That friendship was forged in having created and having helped develop something together, because we were brought into a narrative which was underpinned by a care ethic. The narrative was of growth and of development and of progress, which was mutual and mutually beneficial.
Yeah, that's the sign of being able to create this culture where people are really thriving and they feel like parts of something bigger, that they actually keep those relationships so long after. Alex, I would like to wrap up with my typical 3 questions. The first one of them is, what would be your 3 pieces of advice for our genius leaders listening or watching?
Yeah.
And it can be in any area. It can be personal, business owner.
Create a narrative. Absolutely create a narrative. And I don't mean create a narrative based on we want to have a turnover of 10 million pounds next year. That's not a narrative. That's a tactical goal. I mean a narrative which is a story of which galvanizes people and excites people. That's the first thing. Second, listen and learn, and by doing so, empower others to feel their voices heard. The final thing, which I think is absolutely consistent, is absolutely crucial, and is something that I learned through mistakes, is consistency. Actually, if you are in that top-down structure, be consistent. That doesn't mean you can't change your mind. It doesn't mean you can't change your mind. But I think people need to know where they stand with you. A kind in which they feel they trust you because you're consistent. They believe in, and by consistent, I mean be consistent in bringing people in the first 2 things. I'm going to have a fourth one, which I think is really fundamental, which is have a care ethic. Be caring.
Okay. That's okay to have 4.
I mean, I just think it's just essential.
Yeah, it's a foundation for everything else, I would say.
If you don't care about people as human beings, as they're your colleagues, you're working together, but if you don't care about them as individuals and true empathy, then I think you shouldn't be a leader.
Yeah, great. I love it, Alex. And one practical piece of advice that you could give to our listeners or viewers that they can start implementing already today.
Well, I'm going to go back to it. Write that narrative. Write down your narrative, and if you feel you've got a narrative, write it down in 2-3 sentences, and then ask everyone else, what's our narrative, and get them to tell you, and then write it together. Build a narrative together, because to my mind, that's fundamental and this is something you might need to do on a regular basis. Every year you might need to get together and say, let's revisit the narrative. What are we here for? What are we here for? What's our purpose? And the narrative at the heart of it is absolutely, I think, fundamental to that goal, because that's beyond selling widgets. What's the narrative that you're doing? What does that widget do for people to help people's lives? And and that's the narrative, etc. Right? And I think once that's something that I would really encourage. That's a practical thing to do, because I think it has manifest benefits for the business, but importantly for individuals. There's a kind of fulfillment to hearing a story and being part of a story, and the building and extension and extending that story. It's a wonderful, we respond strongly as children. We're told stories, and it's exciting for us to be in the dramatis personae of a narrative in a story, which is what's going on where you're in your workplace. That's it's fantastically exciting.
I come to think about this anecdote story about when people who are building the church or a cathedral are asked what they're doing. And one is saying, I'm laying bricks. The other one is saying, I'm building a church. And the third one is saying, I'm creating the house of God. And I think this is really about creating that narrative.
Yeah.
And you as a leader have the power to actually create the narrative that everyone sees that they're building something very meaningful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, professionally, semiotics is about, which I do professionally, commercial, cultural insight. It's very much about building meaning, and we know that the delivery of meaning, one of the key delivery mechanisms for the delivery of meaning is storytelling, narrative structures. And I agree with you. Laying a brick is functional. Building a house of God is emotional. And there's something which lifts the human heart, even if you're an atheist. I think the idea of building something which is a space of awe and wonder is something, and you're a participant in that, is fantastic.
Yeah, it was a great conversation, Alex. I'm very grateful for it. Last question would be, if people want to know more about semiotics and Science Salad or connect with you, how can they go ahead with that?
Oh, sure. Everyone's welcome to come to signsalad.com with which has a website. We've got lots of articles on there, which we're constantly producing, which are great fun and really interesting. Everything from the semiotics of cheese, the cultural meaning of cheese, to the cultural meaning of dating, through to why cultural insight is important for brands. So, and there is a description and an introduction to what semiotics is and why thinking semiotically is helpful as a person as well as a business. So very welcome to get in touch with us that way, and welcome anyone to do so.
Great. I'll add the show note, the link to the show notes. Thanks again for this wonderful conversation. I'm sure that people will have this passion in their lives as well about the narrative and building it, and also creating the followership.
Thank you, Anna. I'm very touched to have been and privileged to have been invited, and forgive me for rambling at times, but I've learned a lot from the conversation as well. So thank you.
Happy to hear that, and it was my pleasure. Bye, Alex.
Take care.